welcome the man who is the founder of the Oath Keepers organization. I like to call it the Oath Keepers Ministry because it's a tremendous ministry to this country in this time. To call those who are public officials, call those who are in law enforcement, call those who are in the military back to their oath of office, to stand firm for the Constitution. So just welcome, please, Stewart Rhodes.
Thanks. Thank you. Hey, thanks, brother. Hey, thanks, man. Well, thanks, folks. I'm going to go as long as you can stand it. So if you get your start getting a little bit numb, let me know, and we'll do a potty break. But I also want to give you the opportunity to do any questions and answers you might have. I started Oath Keepers because I realized we're in big trouble. Our country is on its deathbed, and what it has is a metastasizing cancer in its own government that's being fed by both parties. So I'm not going to come here and blow smoke up your skirt and try to fool you into thinking it's only a Democratic problem. It's not. It's far worse than that. We've got oath breakers in both parties for many generations, in fact, at least many decades, who have violated their oath that they all swore to defend the Constitution. And they have desecrated it, and they have violated it, and they have done their very best to kill this country, and they're almost successful. And so I see Oath Keepers as like triage. You know what triage is? It's where you're trying to stop the major bleeding and keep the patient from dying on the spot so you can fix everything else down the road. So I encourage you to start thinking in those terms. If you don't roll back right now the tyranny that's being placed over us by every means you have available, it's either sweat now or bleed later. And frankly, the window of opportunity for any kind of peaceful resolution is rapidly closing. And it might even be too late. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see the future. I don't know. Is it possible we could win peacefully? With a mass awakening of enough Americans, I think the answer is yes. And I think that given enough time, we would win peacefully. Because there is an awakening happening right now. It's being fueled in large part by the internet. The freedom of information exchange on the internet is like the printing press back in the 1600s. Where you didn't have a monopoly anymore on information. Now, most of you are old enough to remember back when it used to be the major networks, and that was pretty much it. What other avenues were there for communication? Face-to-face, newsletters through the mail, and then talk radio came up. But the internet is this revolution of free thought and freedom of exchange, which is why they'll have to shut it down eventually. So given enough time, I think it's true that we are awakening more Americans now than ever before. Exponential awareness and awakening is happening. How many folks here have seen the Matrix movie? So you see, when you take the red pill and you start to see what's going on, well, most of the people in the Liberty Movement, I would say, are red pill people. They now are aware of what's going on, and after they've taken that red pill, it's impossible to fool them anymore. So the powers that be can no longer monopolize free exchange of information and ideas, and their propaganda no longer works on you. And they know that. They have a serious problem. Once you're awake and aware, they know they can no longer manipulate you, whether it's through false flags or propaganda and through your own fear. They won't work anymore. So what are they going to do with you? Well, why do you think DHS is buying up billions of rounds of ammunition and prepositioning it across the country and buying up MRAPs, mine-resistant armored vehicles? It's because, and why do they want to put drones in the sky? And why is the NSA building this massive data center in Utah? Is it for Al-Qaeda? I mean, do you really believe that? Of course you don't. I'm preaching the choir here. It's not for Al-Qaeda, it's for you. And more Americans are starting to realize that. What they are erecting right now is the American version of Stasi East Germany. It is no different. In East Germany, you know what they had? The technology was more limited back then. They had massive towers over East Berlin with cameras and high-powered spotting scopes being manned 24/7. What was the point of that? It was psychological. It was to make the East German people feel they were always being watched. The big brother was always watching. Just like George Orwell said in 1984, where it was a television screen in your home. What is it today? It's the drones over us. The FBI has already admitted now that they use drones domestically. And Congress just passed by statute a mandate that the FAA prepare the way for 30,000 drones in U.S. skies. That will be the equivalent of, actually, it's far exceeding anything in East Germany. That was a dream they could never fulfill. They didn't have the technological ability. If you let your own government put 30,000 drones over your heads, you will deserve whatever comes after that. You better draw a line right now that you will not live under a total information awareness, which is what they call it, total information awareness. You will not live under that kind of system. Is that what the founders gave us? They fought a revolution. You know, the first cause of taking up, of resistance and taking up arms was? It was warrantless searches. It was what they called writs of assistance, where any customs agent, whenever he wanted to, could go search any home, any business, any person, without a warrant, without proving probable cause to a judge, just on his own say-so alone. And they rebelled against that. It was one of the first causes of taking up arms. In fact, many years later, long after the revolution was done, John Adams said, the revolution really began back in 1763 in the arguments of James Otis, the lawyer, against the writs of assistance. He said, in that courtroom, there and then, the child of liberty was born in America. And they stood on not just their rights as Englishmen, they did stand on that, but they also stood on their natural rights. It is an abomination and a violation of the laws of nature and nature's God to have your government watching everything you do 24/7. But that's what they want over you. It's the same thing that you deal with in every dictatorship in human history. They want you to feel like you're always being watched. And Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian philosopher in the mid-18th century, mid-19th century, actually 1860, mid-18th century. No, that's 19th. I'm sorry, I get mixed up like that. That's the 19th century. 1860s, he wrote this treatise about the ideal school and the ideal prison and the ideal work factory. You know what it was? A circular building where all the rooms were open on the inside, no interior wall, and a tall tower in the middle of it, so that they were always being observed. And the tower itself had windows they could not see into. Back then, they were wooden slats. Today, it'd be mirrored glass. So that you couldn't tell if you were a worker or a prisoner or a student. You couldn't tell if the master was watching you in particular. So you always felt the pressure and the weight of eyes on you, and you would self-censor. He thought this was a very efficient way to run a country, to make sure that the people knew they were being watched or felt the feeling of being watched, whether or not that guard's eyes were on them at any one time. What has happened now is the United States government, or elements within it, the national security structures within it, have created a high-tech version of the Panopticon. That's what it was called, the Panopticon. Always watching. They don't need towers. They have our internet traffic, they've got our phone traffic, and they've got these drones. So that's what's coming. And that's been building for decades. It didn't start with 9/11. And what's the point of it? The point of it is a domestic enemies list of those they see as a threat to their agenda. And who is that? That's you. And in particular, you veterans out there. How many here are veterans? When you swore that oath, you veterans, was it just for a term of 4 years or 8 years? It's for life. You were under that obligation, that oath, so long as you're on this side of the grass. And they know that. And they know that's a powerful weapon. The founders gave us that weapon in the Constitution itself, in Article 6, the oath requirement that every officer at every level of government, federal and state, must take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Most of the politicians don't care about it. They take their oath with their fingers crossed behind their back, because they don't really mean it. But they do know that most of you, the lion's share of those who serve in military service, take it seriously. And they know that. And they also know they have been unsuccessful in brainwashing you and stamping out your culture. They know that. They know there are plenty of traditional Americans today. And even if you've never served in the military, you're still a problem for them. We focus on, in Oath Keepers, we focus on the guys who've taken the oath because we do understand they're like a sleeping giant. A massive population of veterans, many of them combat vets, a large population now of current serving military, police, and first responders who are traditional Americans who take the Constitution seriously. But that doesn't mean that the rest of you who have never sworn that oath officially are off the hook either. You're duty-bound also to preserve our Bill of Rights, to preserve this republic. And I know some guys, some of the more competent warriors I know have never served in the military. But they grew up hunting, they grew up shooting, they know how to track, they know how to hunt, they know how to find their way in the woods. They're very good guerrilla fighters if they have to be. And because of our negligence, I'm talking about all the rest of us here, all of us, over the last few decades in particular, they may have to. It's our own fault for letting these oath breakers in Washington, D.C. continue on to desecrate our Constitution. And I'll tell you what, I think the most dangerous factor in the destruction of our Constitution has been the two-party system, because it has led to people who will vote Republican even when they know that the Republican candidate or incumbent has already violated his or her oath. It happens over and over again. In New York State, for example, 10 Republicans in the state legislature sided with the Democrats to pass the so-called SAFE Act. What do you call a person who designs to disarm the American people? What is that? It's treason. Only a foreign occupying enemy force would ever desire to disarm the population in a free country because they fear the people. So when you have so-called conservatives who side with the enemies of the Republic and violate their oath by violating the Constitution, they're traitors and oath breakers. You need to start calling them that. And you need to stop voting for them. If you vote for the lesser of two evils by voting for a Republican oath breaker instead of the Democratic oath breaker because you're so afraid of the Democrat, what is that? Are you keeping your oath? It's like taking a reduced dose of poison, saying, I don't want to take 100% poison, so I'm going to take 80% instead. And then doing that over and over again. What's going to happen to you? You're going to die. And this republic has gotten a dose after dose after dose of watered-down rhinos who have fed us poison because they trust you, they rely on your fear. The fear of the Democrat drives you to vote for an oath-breaking Republican. They know it, too. How else could they get away with running a guy like John McCain over and over again? Or Mitt Romney. He voted, as the governor of Massachusetts, he signed into law an assault weapons ban in Massachusetts at state level. Was that a violation of his oath or not? It was. He also agreed, he says he trusts President Obama with the power of life and death over you to kill Americans with drone strikes. Let me talk to you about that for a second. There are 3 events that drove me to found Oath Keepers, 3 principal events. One was Waco, what I saw there. Use of military force against American citizens, military rules of engagement, and Ruby Ridge. Military rules of engagement, where they accepted, acceptable losses of collateral damage, which were little kids and their mothers. Another big wake-up call for me was Hurricane Katrina, another one, where we saw unlawful orders being obeyed. Maybe with innocent ignorance. I'm sure a lot of the police and military who obeyed those orders to go and round up guns house to house had the best of intentions and thought they were doing the right thing. In fact, I count on it. The reason I count on that is if they are being honorable and thinking they're doing the right thing and all it was ignorance, we can cure that. And so we know that if they know what's right, we know they have courage. We know they have a sense of honor. You can go look at the rosters of how many Medal of Honor winners we have now, or Bronze Stars and Silver Stars from Afghanistan and Iraq across the services, or the Navy Cross. A lot of them. They still have courage. They're not cowards, but do they know what's right or wrong? And there has been an intentional dumbing down and erasing of our own history and heritage and culture in this country so that they are ignorant of why. They're ignorant of our entire history going back to Lexington and Concord Bridge. If you were to ask, in fact, I just saw something the other day online where they asked some Americans, well, why do we celebrate July 4th? What country did we separate from? Did we declare independence from? And a lot of them couldn't answer. They guessed China. They guessed all kinds of stupid things. That's how you can get young servicemen and young police officers obeying orders to go and violate a core principle in the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment. That's how you can get them to violate another one, the Fourth Amendment. If they're ignorant of their own history and heritage, they will do it. So that was a big wake-up call for a lot of us. And sometimes I get some flack that people will be like, well, look, man, our military will do the right thing. How dare you question their sense of honor? How dare you even question whether or not they'll obey unlawful orders? Of course they won't obey those orders. I can point to Katrina and say they did it there. And at Waco, they gave military assistance to the ATF when they asked for it, and the FBI. And a lot of those FBI agents on the HRT team, a lot of them are veterans too, and they also violated their oaths. So don't tell me that they will always say no. But on the other side of it, sometimes I get some patriots who say, well, of course they're going to obey orders. They're all afraid. They're all cowards. They'll do whatever it takes to save their own skin. Is that also true? No, that's also false. Both are wrong. The truth is somewhere in the middle. And a good indicator of that was the survey given in 1994 at 29 Palms. You guys remember that? That was a survey given by Lieutenant Commander Guy Cunningham, who was a naval commander doing his doctoral thesis. And he was concerned about the increasing indoctrination in the officer corps. He saw it in the war colleges towards being under UN command and less allegiance to the United States Constitution. And so he asked a series of questions of a Marine combat unit at 29 Palms. And one of the questions, of course, a lot of them related to would you serve under foreign command. One of them was like a new soldier's creed, that I'm an international citizen and I will fight to protect the world, that kind of thing. But one of the questions was whether or not they would disarm Americans who were resisting gun disarmament. He proposed a hypothetical situation where Congress has passed an absolute ban on the possession of certain military pattern semi-automatic rifles, and then people were given so many days to turn them in, and after that they were subject to being arrested and thrown in prison. And Americans resisted, would not do it. And he asked the Marines, under those conditions, would you fire on Americans who were resisting gun confiscation? And about 18% said yes. Another portion, somewhere around 25%, I believe, said not just no, but hell no. Strongly disagree. A lot of them wrote little notes in the margin that I would shoot the officer who gave me that order, or I would immediately desert and go home and join the resistance. There were a lot of notes like that. But 18% said they would do it. And another percentage, a sizable percentage, said they had no opinion. And as Commander Cunningham said, he spoke with us, he spoke for us on Lexington Green in 2009 when we first founded Oath Keepers. He said, how can they have no opinion on a question like that? And he also pointed out that even in the Marine Corps, whose motto is Semper Fi, always faithful, you still had 18% said they would do it. Another sizable portion sitting it out as though they had no opinion. Now what is that? It's a reflection of human nature is what it is. You can go back and look at the American Revolution. Same thing happened then. There were loyalists who would do what they were told. There were hardcore patriots who would give anything, especially their lives, and they did, for liberty. And there were those in the middle who blew with the wind, depending upon whose flag was raised over the Capitol in their colony at the time. Same thing's true today. There will be some who will do what's wrong, but there will be some who will do what's right. And there already have been. Look at Michael New. What was he doing? He was upholding his oath. Or Colonel Lakin, another one. They were also following their convictions, doing what was right. And both of them very similar. In both cases, they were never even allowed to present evidence that the order they were being given was unconstitutional. Never allowed to go to the heart of the matter. So you will not always get justice in the courts. That's true in the military courts. It's also true in the civilian courts. But does that absolve them of their duty? No. The same goes for you veterans. By doing what's right, you may lose your life. You may lose your liberty. You may wind up in prison. You know, Henry David Thoreau once remarked that when the law is unjust, the proper place for a just man is in prison. He was willing to go to jail on his principles. And we need to be willing to do that too. I encourage you to play it smart and pick your battles. But you need to understand that we are right now in a position that's very much like the founding generation was in about 1774, on the eve of conflict. They had suffered, as they said in the Declaration of Independence, a long train of abuses. And this is a copy of the Declaration right here. I don't have a prepared speech. I'm just talking off the top of my head. But what they say, they said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." That's the whole point of government, is to secure your rights. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Whenever any form of government, including this one right here that they established for us, any government can become tyrannical, can be destructive of the ends of just government, which is your life, liberty, and property. They faced that. And they said, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed." It's just part of human nature to try to get along, to try to make it work, to put up with a lot. And they put up with a long train of abuses, quite a few. Some folks nowadays will say Americans are too soft. Because they haven't revolted yet, Americans will never revolt. They're all a bunch of sheep. Is that true? Like every other human being on the face of the earth who's not a sociopath, we cherish peace. We want to enjoy the peace of our homes and our families and our country in peace. We don't want war. We don't want bloodshed, because we know it'll be right here among us, just like it was in their time. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right and it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. They had no choice. They were driven to the point where they had nothing left to give up. They had backed up as far as they could without subjecting themselves to absolute tyranny. As Patrick Henry said in his famous speech just a month before the fighting began at Lexington and Concord, "When shall we be stronger? Will it be when we're bound hand and foot and a British soldier is in place in every home? Today it's done electronically. Men cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. And there comes a point where you have to say, we have no choice but to fight. They reached that point. We are on the cusp. Now, what were the causes of the American Revolution? What were they? What was it? Give me one of them. What did you say? I heard someone say something. Taxation. So taxation without representation. Was that it? That's what you learn in school. Every time I give this speech, and I talk about, or any speech, I talk about the cause of the American Revolution, that's the first one I hear. That's what you're taught in school. They were upset because they didn't have representation in Parliament. Well, yeah, that was one of their grievances. But there was a long laundry list. What else was there? They're right there in the Declaration. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. She's right. Who else knows one?
Sending out swarms of officers to eat out our substance.
That's right. That was another one. For what? They suspended their legislatures. In fact, one of the things that Parliament did in reaction to the Boston Tea Party was the Boston Port Act. You know about that, right? They blockaded Boston and they tried to starve them out, essentially. But one other thing they also did is they suspended all town meetings. Things like this. They said, oh, the town meetings are the problem. All these hotheads get there like Sam Adams and they stir everybody up. They stir up the rabble. And Hancock, that notorious smuggler Hancock, gets in there and starts talking to these people and they go nuts. So we got to cancel all town meetings. And they did that throughout Massachusetts, not just Boston. Now, they did that, they made a huge mistake because then they ticked off all the folks who lived out in the country who really didn't care much about what was going on in Boston. They just wanted to tend to their farm and live their lives. But all of a sudden, they were told that they no longer could self-govern. They no longer could come together as farmers, as landowners, as merchantmen, and get together and talk about the rules over their own lives and self-government. That's when they really woke up the sleeping giant of the people of Massachusetts. And I was just reading a really good book about that. It's called Bunker Hill. It's a really good book. And he talks about in there how the folks in the country were actually far more radical than the people in Boston, in the city. Way more radical. And a lot of them were French and Indian War veterans. And a lot of them had served in the militias and fought against the Indians for generations. They knew how to fight. And so they were ticking off guys who would plow their field with a musket and a hatchet handy nearby. That's the kind of people they were dealing with. Not merchants, fat, happy merchants in Boston anymore. So yes, they sent out a swarm of officers to eat out their substance. What else? His will alone for their tenure. That's right. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, she mentioned that, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Now, does that sound familiar? Where did that happen? It happened at Ruby Ridge, for one. There was going to be state charges against the officers, against the FBI, but it was moved to federal court and then dismissed. After Waco, was anybody charged with murder or tried with murder? No. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. That is happening right now. The Bill of Rights, our Constitution, the supreme law of the land, the fundamental construct of our government is now being destroyed. It's being turned upside down and replaced. Rather than a national government with very few undefined powers, as Madison promised in Federalist 10, he said, well, it's Federalist 45, he said the new government will be a few and defined powers, and the states will reserve the general police power over the day-to-day affairs of the people. Is that true today? It's upside down. One charge against the king, and of course Parliament as well, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Does that sound familiar? When Pelosi was asked under what part of the Constitution does she have the authority to pass Obamacare, what'd she say? Are you serious? They believe they can pass any law they want to, unless you can go and find a particular clause in the Constitution that explicitly says no. Is that the design the founders gave us? That's upside down. The founders gave us a structure which said that the national government had only those powers delegated and the rest were reserved to the states or the people, and the people, as the 10th Amendment confirms. Now, did that start with the 10th Amendment, though? It's the very nature of our republic. We were sovereign states under the Articles of Confederation, sovereign states, who then delegated a certain small fracture of their sovereignty to a new national government. Not all of it. A general police power is a power to make rules and laws over anything you want to that you think is good. Your state legislature has a general police power. In the state of Washington, the legislature can pass any law that they believe is proper, good and proper, and just, unless you can show a provision in the national Constitution or the Constitution of the state of Washington that says no. They have a general police power. The national government is supposed to be the exact opposite. Only those powers delegated, Article 1, Section 8. But they have flipped it around, and through a gross manipulation of an interpretation of the Commerce Clause, they have now given themselves a general police power over everything. Try to name one thing they can't regulate. I dare you to find one. One thing. Which way your toilet flushes. How big it can be. How much water it can use. The design of the seat. Which hand you have to use. Whether or not you need help. They could legislate and regulate that you must have an official government agent right there to wipe for you. If they believe they can do anything, unless you can run to the Constitution and find in there where they cannot do it. And that's what a lot of Americans do. They'll say things like, even Republicans will say stuff like, well, there's no right in the Constitution to that. Is that an accurate way to think? Where do your rights come from? Your right to bear arms, does that start with the Second Amendment? Your right to free speech? Am I able to speak like this and you're able to listen only because the First Amendment says we have a right to free speech and association? No. It's a God-given right. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So whenever you run to the Bill of Rights to look and see if you have a right to do something, you're making a fundamental error. The Bill of Rights is really misnamed. It should be the Bill of Protections of Rights. You notice the First Amendment doesn't say the people are hereby granted the right to free speech and assembly and freedom of religious exercise. No, it says Congress shall make no law. It's a prohibition on the government. It's not a grant to you. Same goes with the Second Amendment. It doesn't say the people are hereby granted the right to keep and bear arms. What's it say? The right of the people, which already exists, to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Always remember that. Back in 1775 at Concord Bridge, was there a Second Amendment? No. And what were they fighting for? They were fighting to preserve their natural right of self-preservation. They had suffered a long train of abuses, among which were not just the ones we talked about, but also denial of jury trial. He has in many cases denied us the privilege or the benefit of trial by jury. That was important to them. Under a free republic, in both the English Constitution's republic and under ours, who could take away your life for liberty? Can the government do it? Can they? Not lawfully. Only a jury of your peers can judge you guilty and take away your life or your liberty. That's it. Only a jury of your peers. Well, they can put you in jail. They can't kill the spirit of liberty, but they could take away your physical liberty. But only a jury of your peers can do it. That's how it was in the English Constitution as well. And yet, Parliament and the king and his ministers were frustrated by the resistance they were getting from Americans, from smugglers like John Hancock, for example, and they wanted to be able to punish them. They knew a jury of their peers in Boston or Massachusetts would never convict them. And so instead, they passed a law saying, well, we can go ahead and move that over to admiralty jurisdiction and have an admiralty court take care of that instead. And they also would spirit them across the seas to be tried for pretend offenses at a place inconvenient for witnesses to go, and of course, not in front of a jury of their peers where they lived. So that was one of the causes also in the Declaration, being taken to England for trial. or just being thrown onto a brig ship and having some admiral in the middle of the ocean try you and chuck you over the side. That's right. So, the reasons your forefathers fought and bled was not just taxation without representation. It was an absolute, as it says, an absolute despotism over them, stripping away their ancient rights, their ancient safeguards for their liberty, making them subject to the arbitrary will of military commanders, martial law, like Commander Gage, General Gage in Boston. He was made the military commander over Boston and also the governor over Massachusetts. They said to the king, he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. That's what happens when a government treats its own people like a military foreign enemy. When they apply the laws of war, when they apply military force to their own people, when they attempt to disarm them, which is an act of war, when they throw them in a military brig ship without a trial by jury, that is abdicating the right to rule, abdicating any authority whatsoever by waging war against them. This government today has done exactly the same thing. I gave you two reasons to start Oath Keepers. One was Waco, second was Katrina, but in between those two events, there came 9/11. And right after 9/11, while I was still a student at Yale Law School, first-year student there, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. I saw both Republicans and Democrats, both left and right, among the students and among the teachers, agreeing with the idea that the President of the United States had the power to hold and detain American citizens as if they were foreign enemies in wartime, and also the claimed power that he could try them in front of a military tribunal and have them executed without a jury. No grand jury indictment, no charges of a crime, under the idea that they could treat an American exactly the same as a goat herder in Iraq or Afghanistan, and either just kill you, which is what you can do to an enemy in wartime, right? What can you do to an enemy? You can kill them on sight, whether they're holding a gun or not. They're part of the military machine. You can capture them and detain them for the duration of the conflict. Or if you believe they violated the laws of war, you can try them for violations of laws of war in front of a military tribunal. That's what you can do to a foreign enemy. Can you do that to American citizens? Not constitutionally. Now why? Where in the Constitution can you find the prohibition on that? Well, you can't answer. Cornell can't answer. Neither can Matt. What in the Constitution guarantees you a right to jury trial? Where's it at? What article is it? Anybody know? In God's name, how are you going to defend the Constitution if you don't know it? It's Article 3, Section 2. All trials, except for impeachment, shall be by jury. Okay? And the very next one, Article 3, Section 3, is the Treason Clause. And what does that say? Anybody have any idea at all? Folks, you got to know your own Constitution. I should just shut up right now and you guys should just go home and read the Constitution. Article 3, Section 3, the Treason Clause says, no person shall be convicted of the crime of treason. Oh, actually, first it defines treason. Treason shall consist only in making war against the United States or aiding their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. That's the smoking gun. What was Jose Padilla, an American citizen, accused of doing? He was the dirty bomb plotter, right? Remember that? Back in 2001 or 2002 it was? He was accused of plotting with Al-Qaeda to blow up a dirty bomb in Chicago. He was held for 3 years in a military brig in South Carolina. How many here support that being done to an American citizen? Okay. But you should know why it's so wrong. The smoking gun, the Treason Clause, that tells you what he was accused of was treason, making war against the United States or aiding their enemies. Al-Qaeda is our enemy, right, in the war on terror? So an American accused of making war against his own country, aiding the enemy, gets a jury trial. Article 3, Section 2, And it says in Article 3, Section 3 of the Treason Clause, after it defines the crime of treason, it says no person shall be convicted of treason unless upon the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act. 2 witnesses. Nowhere else in criminal law can you ever find that kind of burden of evidence. Nowhere else. If I shoot my neighbor's dog, does it require 2 witnesses? No. Circumstantial evidence can do it. 1 witness could do it. Same goes for murder or rape or robbery, anything else. You don't need 2 witnesses. 2 witnesses to the same overt act. Because they knew that the charge of treason, of making war against your own country, is the most serious charge against any citizen. And they knew that you would be hated and demonized just upon the accusation, as Padilla was. Was he a dirtbag? Sure he was. That's not the point. The point is, if you let a dirtbag be hauled off without a grand jury indictment into a military brig for 3 years, thrown in a hole with no jury trial, if you let that be done to him, if you allow that to happen to him, it will happen to you and your children and your grandchildren. You have got to give the devil the protections of the Constitution. The most evil man you can think of. Nowadays, being called a traitor, even back then, was actually even worse than being called a child molester. But what happens to someone accused of being a child molester? Do folks say, well, he's innocent until proven guilty? Do they wait for that before they condemn him and judge him to be guilty? It's human nature. And the founders knew it. And they had already seen in English history and in their own experience tyrants using that charge. So they put in extra guarantees. 2 witnesses, the same overt act. Or confession in open court, it says. Or confession in open court. Now, why do they insist upon confession in open court? That's exactly right. This lady deserves a free dinner or something. That's right. Torture. They had seen the history of the Star Chamber in England, where you had friends of the king in a secret tribunal, secret evidence, not being allowed to face your accusers, and many times coerced confessions. Tortured behind the scenes until you confessed your crimes, and then found guilty on your own confession and then drawn and quartered. And that is exactly what Stalin used to do. He tortured people until they confessed, or he tortured their children and their wives in front of them until they confessed, and then they would have show trials and use those confessions. Same thing the Nazis did. Every dictator on this planet has always done the same thing. The founders understood human nature. These are timeless truths. These are timeless lessons. And folks, if you are ignorant of your own Constitution, you are ignorant of those lessons. You can't defend something you don't know. You have got to go and read your Constitution. I also urge you, just yesterday was July the 4th. Yesterday, every one of you should have sat down and read the Declaration of Independence. You should have done it yesterday, so that you know nothing's new under the sun. Nothing's new. Human nature never changes. This is like a revival. It really is. I'm like a traveling preacher. I'm trying to wake you up to the timeless truths that have always been there. These are natural laws. These are immutable laws of nature, and nature's God. The founders understood that. And so they put in place what they thought were checks and barriers against the exact same things they had just experienced happening again. If you go through the Declaration of Independence and you line up the things they accused the king of doing, and then you lay out the Bill of Rights next to it, line by line, you will see a direct line from one to the other. Or things that they don't even have to mention, like trying to confiscate their guns. April 19, 1775 was not the beginning of their grievances. It was the end. It was the final last straw where they had to fight back. But they had already put up with denial of jury trial. They had already put up with confiscation of property, warrantless searches, military government and martial law being imposed upon them, suspension of their own normal government, gross violations of the rights of Englishmen, and gross violations of their natural rights. They waited. They put up with a lot. Don't think that Americans today are too weak to fight back and don't have the resolve. We're no different than they were. They put up with a lot because they wanted peace. But when it came right down to it, when they had no choice but to fight, is when they came for their guns. And that's why, if you look at our list of Declaration of 10 Orders Oath Keepers will not obey, current serving oath keepers. Number one is we will not obey orders to disarm the American people. Now, why is that there? Is it because that's the most important right? Is it? I don't think it is. They're all equally important, but it is the one you can't do without. It's a military necessity that you be armed. Now, I want to ask you, when they wrote the Bill of Rights in the attempt to prevent a reoccurrence of all of those abuses, what was one thing they were very careful about? To preserve their liberty. They had, I submit, there were two critical institutions they had to preserve. One was what? Name one. Which is what? What institution is that? By yourself? Yeah, the militia. Not just individually. Yes, you have a right to self-defense and self-preservation. It's the first law of nature. And many of the state constitutions, Bill of Rights, recognize the right to bear arms, to hunt, protect your own property, etc. But they also said, and to protect your community in the militia. That was their answer to that ancient question of who shall guard the guardians. That's been a philosophical puzzle that's bothered guys all the way back to Socrates. When you erect a government to protect your liberty and you have professional warriors to guard you against outside invasion, well then who protects you from them? If you have a professional class of warriors and the rest of you are just merchants and farmers, what do you do when the warriors decide, hey, wait a minute, we got all the weaponry, let's rule? That's a problem, right? It's been there from the very beginning. Their answer was that you are your own guardians. If you are not in a militia, well-regulated, which means well-trained, well-equipped, and organized, then you have abdicated that core responsibility. Dr. Edwin Vieira is correct when he points out that that's why it says in the Constitution, in the Second Amendment, it is necessary for the security of a free state. The militia is necessary, and you will not be free or secure without it. If you don't take care of your own security and you abdicate it to professional warriors, whether they're the military or the police, what have you just done? You've turned yourselves into sheep. That's why I don't like the sheepdog analogy that, people in the military and police are sheepdogs over a flock of sheep. Are you sheep? Do you need sheepdogs? No. Every one of you should be a sheepdog. A whole herd of sheepdogs. Every one of you is supposed to be a warrior, a soldier. Part-time, yes, but nonetheless a soldier. If right now, if we were attacked by some mutant biker zombie horde, who's going to protect us? We are. This is going to protect me until I can get to my car and get my rifle. Same goes for the rest of you guys, I know. You take responsibility for your own self-defense against criminals, right? But we have abdicated our responsibility, our personal, individual responsibility to be the community defense and the defense of our free state. It's necessary for the security and liberty of our free state. Necessary. You have got to, and this is once again a lesson the founders learned. They knew the danger of a standing army. They lived it. They had a standing army over them in Boston, occupying their homes. It was a standing army of regulars in Boston who obeyed orders to confine the people of Boston to Boston. It was a standing army that marched on Lexington and Concord to take away their guns and their powder and confiscate other food stuff and go and capture the leadership. They were obeying unlawful orders to go and arrest the leadership of the resistance, John Hancock and Sam Adams, and as you know, they wouldn't have got a jury trial. They were going to go on a brig ship, and they obeyed those orders. They knew the danger of a standing army. That's why they insisted that you be the major force for defense of your nation and for internal security. What does Article 1, Section 8 say that Congress has the power to call forth the militia to do? What three functions? And Cornell can't answer that either. Yes, suppress insurrections. What's another one? Don't know? Execute the laws of the Union. That's the second one. What's the third one? Come on, guys. You don't know? To repel invasion, that's right. Why is it this lady has more knowledge of the Constitution than the veterans in this audience? What is going on? You guys got to read your Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 tells you that Congress has the power to call forth the militia to suppress insurrections, to execute the laws of the Union, and to repel invasions. What that means is the militia, that means you are supposed to be so well equipped and organized and trained that you can repel a foreign invasion. You're the first stop for domestic security. Real homeland security, constitutional homeland security, is you and the militia. Dr. Edwin Vieira has a good book called that, Constitutional Homeland Security, that I recommend you read. There's also a good series of articles he's written that's on the Oath Keepers website, all about the militia and about why it's so essential. You are supposed to be the internal security. That means if the President of the United States execute the laws of the Union, right? Does it say anything about the FBI or the CIA or NSA or NORTHCOM or U.S. Standing Army troops executing the laws of the Union? No. Who does it? You do. If the President has to rely on you, the people, as the militia to go and enforce federal laws, what happens if you believe the laws are unconstitutional? Can he do it without you if you're the tool of enforcement? Do you understand? Can you see how brilliant the founders were? If we were to only follow their design, he would have no choice but to rely on, go hat in hand, to the state militias and try to call them forth. What could the governors do if the governors, who were also oath-sworn, if they believed that the president was trying to enforce an unconstitutional law, like, say, gun confiscation or banning guns or Obamacare, what could the governor say? He could say no. The governor is commander-in-chief over the state militia unless and until they're called into federal service, right? But can the president or Congress call forth the militia to enforce something that's not constitutional? They might think they can, but the states reserve the option of disagreeing and saying no. And if he had to rely on the state militias to do it, and they said no, he'd be dead in the water. You shouldn't even need oath keepers. You shouldn't even need to be reminded of these principles, but also you shouldn't need me to worry about the standing army that shouldn't exist. We used to have in this country a tradition of a very small professional officer corps. Guys went to West Point or Annapolis, and a very small skeleton of a professional military force. And in peacetime, they would rely on the militia to be their first response to any kind of invasion or sudden attack. And then they would raise an army for the duration of the conflict. And then after that, what would happen? They'd all go home back to the militia again. That was what a free republic does. But since the start of the Cold War, we have had a massive standing army. And Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, when he served as president, I encourage you to go watch or read his farewell address. And what did he warn against in that farewell address? The military-industrial complex. He said, look, even when it's seen as necessary, because we're facing world communism, this world Cold War, you still have to be aware of the danger of a permanent establishment of a military-industrial complex, and the danger that it would grow far beyond its intended purposes in unjust power and danger to your liberties. And what do you think the NSA is right now? Or the CIA? And now we have the CIA is building a new headquarters in Denver for domestic operations. Started out of the OSS in World War II with the intention of monitoring signal traffic from the enemy. Foreign threats now turned internal. And same goes for the NSA, which is now building this massive data center, which we now know. Of course, we knew during the Bush administration they were already spying on us. It's nothing new to me. Since the 1950s, the United States government has maintained an enemies list. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI sent a letter to the Truman White House letting them know that they had a list of potential problem people who would be rounded up during a time of emergency. Of course, back then it was predominantly communists or suspected communists, but that's not the point. They started that enemies list, and it never went away. And it grew and grew and grew, and it went from the hands of the FBI into whose hands do you think got it after that? Take a guess. Which institution started under Carter and then grew like crazy under Reagan and had a dual purpose for supposed disaster relief, but also continuity of government? FEMA. FEMA got the list. And a big part of the purpose of FEMA is not disaster relief, it's continuity of government. That's where you had Rumsfeld and Cheney back then running around with briefcases, special briefcases, while Cheney was a congressman and Rumsfeld was just a CEO of some corporation. But they were part of this shadow government that was put in under the excuse of emergency during a nuclear war. But now that shadow government that was erected during the Cold War to stop communism, to fight communism, and to role play and game and plan for worst case scenarios of a nuclear exchange, that shadow government that was created for that purpose has now been turned on us, on the American people. The NSA is part of that. The CIA is part of that. Just the other day, John Brennan, you know who John Brennan is? John Brennan was Obama's national security advisor who was pretty much in charge of the snuff list of who was going to be killed by predator drone strikes, including U.S. citizens. And then he was rewarded for his obedience and by being placed in charge of the CIA now. So Obama's top drone guy for targeting, including Americans, is now in charge of the CIA. And just the other day, they announced a program in the CIA to stop leaks. Guess what it's called? It's called the Honor the Oath program. And you know what he said in the announcement to it? He said, this is to reinforce our culture of corporate secrecy. That's what he said. Now, is that their oath? Do they swear an oath to a culture of corporate secrecy? So we have a new billboard going up in Washington, D.C., down in the Pentagon station in the D.C. metro that's going to, a couple different ones as a matter of fact, but one of them is aimed at the CIA. It says, CIA, your oath is not to a, quote, culture of corporate secrecy, it's to the Constitution. Honor that oath. And then it says, expose crimes against the Constitution. Now, what graphic did we use for that? We used Kennedy being sworn in. Little dig on the CIA, who I believe killed Kennedy. Point being, folks, is this is not conspiracy theory. Even if you don't believe the CIA killed Kennedy, I don't care. Point is, you've got a government that now has stepped outside the Constitution in many overt ways. The NDAA is just the latest footprint and mile marker of that. Bush, after 9/11, detained 2 U.S. citizens, Jose Padilla and Yasser Hamdi, military detention, no trial. And along with that, claimed the power to try them by tribunal if they wanted to. And along with that, of course, claimed the power to use military force. And I wrote about this at law school. I said, this is what King George did. This is what Parliament did. This is one of the reasons why we had to rebel. What do you call a country where the leader can point at any citizen in that country and on his say-so alone declare them an enemy of the state and have them killed? It's a dictatorship. What do you call it when that leader can point at them and say, he's a bad man, take him away, put him in a cell, no trial? What is that? It's a dictatorship. What would you call it when you can grab any man, woman, or child and throw them in front of a puppet court like Stalin did of hand-picked generals and have them tried by military tribunal and then executed? What is that? It's a dictatorship. It's everything your forefathers fought against. It's one of the reasons why they fought the Revolutionary War. And it's being claimed right now by our government. There is no difference. There is no distinction you can point to legally that's any different between what Obama claims the power to do right now and what Stalin claimed the power to do, or Adolf Hitler, or Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Mao Zedong in China. I challenge you to point to me the difference. Oh, because they're elected? So they're an elected dictator? Once you elect a president, he can then have the power of life and death over you? I won't tell you what I call that because I don't want to cuss in front of you. Point being, folks, the hour is late. You have a government, quite frankly, that's warfare. And in fact, they're being very overt about it. They're saying the president has the power to do these things to any American under the laws of war. And I predicted that eventually it would lead to them actually killing Americans, because that's what you can do to an enemy. And they've begun to do that. They killed what was his name? Al-Awlaki and his teenage son, 16-year-old boy, in Yemen. You might say, well, Al-Awlaki was a dirtbag. He was a known propagandist for Al-Qaeda, and he was. But if you allow, once again, because he's a dirtbag, you don't like him, you allow the president to look at his picture and put an X across it and sign his name and order his execution, order his assassination, what have you just done? You've allowed him to do that to all of us. The law recognizes no difference between Al-Awlaki and the rest of you. What they're saying is your citizenship's irrelevant, that America's like occupied Iraq or Afghanistan. They can do exactly here what they did over there. And what happened in the wake of the Boston bombing? What did you see there? Cordon and search, house-to-house search without warrant, folks being at gunpoint forced out of their homes. And what do you also see? You saw guys like Lindsey Graham and Representative King from New York, two neocon Republicans, clamoring and demanding that the suspect be held as an enemy combatant so they can interrogate him without having to worry about Miranda rights or anything else. They want to do here at home what they've done overseas. There's no difference. And last week I went and reread a memo by Bush lawyer John Yoo during the Bush administration. 2001, he wrote a memo about this, saying, well, the president can do all of these things even here inside the United States. Under the powers of war as commander-in-chief, he can kill the enemy, he can use military force to kill, detain, and try by tribunal. So from the very first moment, they contemplated using those powers here, not just overseas, here against all of you. That's why they're building Skynet. That's why they're building this huge NSA data center. They don't believe the Fourth Amendment applies at all. Their thinking is this is warfare. And it won't be confined just to Al-Qaeda or suspected Al-Qaeda. They think anyone they want to label a military enemy can also be under the jurisdiction of the laws of war. Now, remember there, one of the clauses of taking up arms is they said he has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. That was martial law. And they said he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Let me ask you, what is more foreign to our Constitution than the international laws of war, where the president can treat you like an occupied, defeated enemy population, like was done to Japan under MacArthur, or was done to Germany after we conquered Germany, or Iraq or Afghanistan? Is that legitimate? Is it constitutional? No. What is it, though? They're telling you what it is. It's warfare. It's an act of war. And so when Congress rubber-stamped that by saying that, yeah, we agree with this, and we affirm in the NDAA of 2012, sections 10, 21, and 22, Congress says, we affirm that when we granted the authorization for use of military force back in 2001, we meant